Okay, now we're ready to begin pouring a casting. I've got my mold, two-part mold here. I've got my fiberboard backing pieces. I've got a couple of clamps. And over here I've got the part A and part B of the casting compound. I've got two measuring cups, one for each, and I've got a final mixing cup with its cutout so that I can use it to pour. Finally, I've got a couple of sticks that are rounded, sanded, so they're smooth on the tip, and I can use those for fiddling around in the mold to make sure that it's filling properly. So, we're ready to go. I'm going to begin by pouring part A into a measuring cup. See if I can do this better. Okay, 30 milliliter volume is what I want. Pour 30 milliliters of part A and pour it into the mixing cup. Then I take the other measuring cup and I'm going to pour 30 milliliters of part B into it. Notice that these are both colorless, very watery liquids. They will stay like that after I mix them. Here you can see them in the mixing cup. I'm going to take my stick and make sure that these are mixed thoroughly. I want to do it quickly so I don't waste any of the 7 minutes that I have to pour the castings. So once I get this mixed, it becomes a little bit opaque, translucent, but still somewhat clear. Okay, that's all mixed. Now I'm going to take my molds, first one side and then the other, and I'm going to pour a small amount of mixed resin into each side. Notice that I use one of the mixing sticks as a guide to make sure I can direct the flow of the resin where I want it. Now I'm going to take that stick and make sure that every bit of this mold surface is wetted and that there are no visible air bubbles around. I'm paying particular attention up here to a point under the collar, which has a tendency not to fill very well. You can tip the mold, make sure that the resin flows everywhere and that the entire mold is wetted. Again, taking particular care on the nooks and crannies, belt, suspenders, feet, etc. Okay, now both sides of the mold are wetted. I'm going to pour any excess from one to the other just for a moment, and then I'm going to fit the two halves together. I take my fiberboard backings and I put one on either side of the mold, and then I take my two clamps, put one toward the top and one toward the bottom. Again, as I said before, you snug these up to keep the resin from leaking out, but you don't want it so snug that it deforms the mold. Okay, so now I have my pour spout and my air vent. I'm going to begin filling the mold. Again, I use the stick to help direct the flow, and I just pour resin into the mold until it's full. There. Okay, now resin has come up to the top, and perhaps you can see that there's also resin showing in the air vent hole, indicating that this mold has filled and it's pushed all the air bubbles out. I'm tapping it firmly on the table a few times just to make sure that there are no remaining bubbles, and squeezing it a little bit with my fingers to make the resin move around in the pour hole so I can see that it's full. Okay, this mold is full, and now we're going to set it aside and let it harden. Meanwhile, I had some extra resin, so rather than waste it, I'm going to pour some into this small mold, which in this case happens to be a chicken. Again, pouring small amounts of resin, making sure I get them in the texture of the feathers, in the beak, in the comb, in the eye socket, all the little nooks and crannies where an air bubble could get stuck. Okay, so I do that again to both sides of the mold, and then I fit the two molds together. In this case, I have fiberboard on the outside acting as a reinforcement. So now I just take a rubber band and snug it up around the mold. Bring the pour spout to the top. Again, I have a pour spout, and in this case I have a couple of air vents. So I'm going to take the remaining resin, which is just starting to show signs of hardening and getting a little thicker, but it's still pouring. So I'm going to fill this mold again, squeeze it, tap it, make sure there's resin coming out of the air vents so that I know that this mold is full. And again, we will set this mold aside and allow it to harden. So there's two ways to do a mold. In one case, I used clamps on the outside and a fiberboard reinforcement, and in the other case, I used some foam core on this smaller mold. I just noticed that this mold wasn't quite filled. I think I had a few drips, so I fill it, and now I'm going to leave the rest of the mixed resin in the mixing bowl so I can keep an eye on it and see how it hardens. Meanwhile, I've got a paper towel which I'm going to use to wipe out my mixing cups so I can reuse them. And wipe off my mixing sticks so that I can reuse them also. And then we'll wait for the resin to dry.